Hi everyone and welcome. We're going to be making a charm ring today. It's a really sweet little ring to make, and it's something you can make as full and dramatic or as simple as you like. So what we'll need to get started is I've got about 30 centimeters or 11 1/4 inches of 24 gauge wire. I've got a selection of beads. I'm going to use a little amethyst focal bead. That's a 6mm bead. I've got a couple of 4mm beads and a couple of 2mm beads. It definitely works out better with this project if you use a couple of smaller beads to make your ring look a bit more full. And I've got the same number, so about 6 head pins as well. So we'll get started, and in terms of tools, I'm going to use a ring mandrel because I find it's a lot easier making rings using a ring mandrel. I've got some wire cutters and some round nose pliers, and I'm going to use a little bit of sellotape as well because that's going to make life a little bit easier too. So we'll get started, and we're going to start by making a loop in the end of our 24 gauge wire. So I'm just going to bend that round. So I've moved that sort of about a centimetre or 1/4 inch down the way from the top of the wire, and I'm just going to bend that around my pliers just to make a little bit of a loop like that. Then what I'm going to do is use the longer part of my wire to wrap around that bit that is sticking out there. So we'll just go around twice, and I'll trim the end of that. I'm going to pull this straight now. Okay, and now what I'm going to use is my ring mandrel. And I'm going to wrap this around 3 times. So I want my looped part to be towards the front. I'll just move those beads out of the way. And I'm just going to wrap around. So I'm going to make a size 7. So you want it to be a little bit bigger than what you want the size to ultimately be, because it's going to shrink a little bit because we're going to do a bit of wrapping around the sides. So there is good. So I'm just going to, what I'm going to do, I want my loop to go into this loop. So I'm going to thread my end of the wire through that loop there just so I can make sure I get the right size. Just going to pull it through. Okay, so starting to get towards the end now. Put that bit more through. Carefully, you can see I've moved down the ring mandrel doing that. So we've just got to work our wire into that one there. So now what I'm going to do is take it off because that's going to be easier. And what I basically want to do is I want to have 2 connecting loops in the front. Pull that through a little bit there. Okay. What I'm going to do is just, it's alright that this loop is fairly big because I'm going to actually use that to put our beads onto. Try and get a little bit smaller. Work our wire through, just pass the wire through with the pliers. Okay, I'm just going to, for now, connect my wire by wrapping it around my main structure. So just pull that through. To make life easier, I'm going to put a little bit of tape around here. That stops it from moving about because otherwise you tend to be trying to hold on to multiple parts of it at the same time. I'm just going to wrap my wire around the edge. You could go the whole way through, wrap all around your ring. but I'm only going to go part the way down. So I'm using 24 gauge wire for the whole project this time. You could of course use a thinner wire like a 28 gauge wire or something like that would be a bit easier to move with. But I'm going for sort of a thicker look. Okay, we'll just go around once more and then we'll leave it at that. So I'm just going to trim the end with my wire cutters, and I'm just going to use my pliers just to squeeze that edge down a little bit because we don't want any sharp edges on our ring. Okay, now what we'll do is we'll get rid of that in a second, that tape, but I'm just going to wrap this side, and again I'm not going to go the whole way around, I just want it to be enough to keep our ring in place. You might just have to keep moulding it with your fingers as you go so it doesn't get out of shape. I always find it's a good idea towards the end to sort of put it back on your ring mandrel and just try and flatten, shape it around there a bit with your hands, just flatten it down a little bit. Okay, so we're at the end there, so I'll just trim that end there towards the top. Flatten it down a little bit. And we're just going to keep going just so that we've got the same number of loops on this side as we do on the other side. You can see sometimes it gets a little bit, a few kinks in it, but you can just pull those out with your fingers and you should be okay to keep going. If it gets too kinky, then you can use some pliers with a rubber edge to run through it. And just keep pushing that up towards the side. So we're nearly there. We'll go a couple more times around. So I'm just measuring it up by sight with the other side. I'm not measuring my loops or anything like that. Okay. Squish that all up. Nearly there. I think we'll just go once more. Okay, and then we'll trim the end of that. So as I say, you could keep going all the way around, but you certainly don't have to. I might have to use some oil to get this tape off. So use the wire cutters. Okay, but it's in place now. And that's what we want. So we've got our 2 little loops here, and that's what we're going to use to thread our beads onto. So I'll start with one of our 4mm green beads, and I'm just going to thread that onto a head pin. And I'm going to make a loop in the top, so just like that, and just bend over, so we're about sort of a centimetre, 1/4 of an inch away from the bead. So now that I've made that bend, I don't want to close that loop just yet. I'm going to place it through one of those loops I've created in our ring structure, and then I'm going to wrap it around the wire around towards the bead, just like that. Okay, and then we'll just trim the end of our wire. It's gone flying. Okay, so I might use our sort of larger focal bead this time. This one I want fairly central, so I'm going to make a bigger loop in it. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to thread through, or try to thread through, that loop in the centre and get it as central as I can. And then we'll just do the same, we'll wrap that one around. Try and make sure our loop is sitting straight on, not to the side. Okay, trim the end of that wire. So for this project you could really use however many beads you want. I've made them look quite full sometimes, or you can make it look really delicate. Pop another bead on, we're going to thread that over the other side. I think the best thing to do is just keep adding beads until you feel comfortable with how it looks. You could, of course, use complementary colours like I am here, or you could use various sizes of the same bead or all the same size. I quite like the look of a focal bead and then smaller beads around it. Smaller beads you tend to find, because you can add on more, you can sort of cover any gaps over the round part of your structure. So we're starting to get there now. We'll keep adding a few more beads and go for these smaller ones now. So again, just pop a bend in the top. If you start running out on room on your little rings there, you can actually always thread it through the loop created by another bead. I'm using the same 24 gauge head pins for the smaller beads, but you could certainly use some smaller head pins. Generally, with the smaller beads, some thinner head pins tend to work really well. So we're certainly starting to come together now. It's just sort of, I'm adding my beads on randomly and just in wherever I have space to put them on. You could of course use a bit more structure, but I like things to be a little bit chaotic. I think we'll just add one more of our 2mm glass beads. could of course use any sort of shape you want. You could use semi-precious stones or just glass. I use Swarovski crystals in that one. I might just thread this round our focal bead. Just going to use the loop created by that focal bead to pop this one on. Just thread, loop our head pin around, and then I'll just trim the edge there. Okay, and that's it. We have our little charm ring. You could add whatever sort of little charms. You could even add some silver charms to that if you wanted to. Any sort of beads you wanted, some gemstones, some crystals, whatever you fancy. But there we go. Thanks for joining, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.